Okay, so I wanted to do a video on this video that went viral. It's about this lady who was pulled over by the police, black lady. Um, I felt like everybody involved in this situation responded very weirdly, okay? Like, of course she's crazy. She's a liberal who thinks all police officers are murderers or whatever. I mean, there's really no sense in that. But, you know, there were so many things in this that was like weird to me about the fact that people have this whole idea that you cannot admit certain things or else it's racist. Like, for example, you cannot, if you're a black person, you cannot say that you experience racism uh, from people of other races other than white people. Specifically, you can't say that you experience racism from Mexican people. Don't you think that's a bit racist? To say, to try and quiet and try and stifle someone's voice on the racism they've experienced from other races? Oh, I forgot. We're just supposed to hate all white people for racism. Never mind the fact that many of us have actually experienced more racism from other races than white people. I just want to start off saying, we don't even really have to talk about the racism that some people have demonstrated. Let's just talk about the facts, okay? The facts about Mexican American people. The facts about Mexico. Does anyone know anything about Mexican American people who are black? Does anyone know how black Afro-Mexicans are treated in Mexico? I think before we start calling people racist, we have to be educated first to understand the whole full ramifications of everything. If you are going to say someone is racist because they are claiming people from a country that has systematically been way more racist and way more discriminatory than this country has been to black people. And this country has had a very bad history with black people. Let's just be honest. I mean, we couldn't use the bathroom less than 100 years ago in the same bathrooms white people could. So I mean, like, we've had our share of racism in America, but we can't talk about racism that we might experience or black people in other countries experience. And that is supposed to be racist if anyone admits that there's such a thing as racism in Mexico. Black Americans, I mean, black Mexicans, I'm sorry, black Mexicans, they aren't even in the Constitution. They don't even have the same rights as other Mexicans. Um, I've seen like different articles and videos, and I will put a video in the description of what I'm talking about because there are plenty of people who share different experiences that they've had as black Mexicans in Mexico, where people would say, like, for one, they couldn't go to school because they're black, or they were ostracized from society. Also, other things like the attitude of black Mexicans in Mexico, Afro Mexicans in Mexico, is the idea that basically that they should basically still be slaves. And I'm using a video in the description to show that specifically said by an Afro-Mexican. So, you mean to tell me it is racist to admit that there are inequalities in Mexico, that there are racist and discriminatory behavior in Mexico? There's nothing wrong in admitting that. And I feel like when we try and act like you can't admit that there's racism with people who have systematically been racist to black people for centuries, it only empowers them. You see, this was a situation in California. And I've never lived in California, but I've worked with a lot of black Californians. A lot of black Californians, black people in California, experience lots of racism from Mexican American people. And they experience it with Asian American people as well. But that's what I've heard. They said they get most of their racism from Mexican American and Asian American people. And I feel like when people try and silence black people from speaking of racism experienced from these people, basically, it basically, makes it where we can't be open about it. Then how can we fix it? If we can't be honest about our mistreatment, then how can we ever fix the situation? And the thing is, I feel like in America, generally, we focus on racism from white American people so we can be hoodwinked and not focus on the real racism that we experience with other races of people. Because if you think of it, when they basically in society, in America, when we split black and white up from each other, and we say that black people, you know, we depict them in negative light, you know, in different ways, and we depict white people in negative light. What do we have left? If you think of it, in reality, we are basically like, I mean, in this day and age, there's a lot of anti-white sentiment. It is. Trying to depict them as racist, oppressors, a lot of different negative stuff, honestly. And then with black people, let's be honest, when they talk about black issues, it's always about black people in a negative light. Like, for example, criminal justice reform, as if we're all criminals or something, Or, like, for example, sometimes people even try to talk about, like, government assistance or poverty, you know. People always depict black people as the people who are basically lesser. If we are depicting black Americans poorly and white Americans poorly, we are left with the next population, which would be Hispanic Americans. Largely, that is Mexican Americans. And so, to me, I think that the society that we are moving into is to have that kind of basically the supremacy view with Hispanics on top, because that's what basically Black Americans and white Americans are basically split up, and basically there's basically a divide and conquer situation going on, as well as just basically putting down other races in favor of other races. So when you put black and white people down, you only have them left, basically. You only have like Hispanics left. And I think with that whole idea of how some of society has kind of like tried to present race tells you that basically with this also being that people try to basically act like you can't even admit that Mexican Americans can be racist to black people and are many times much more often than other races even. Basically, a lot of black Americans are forced to be silenced, basically, and not actually be open and honest about their whole experience with racism with other races of people. And the reason why this is silenced also is because of the whole desire to basically put the most focus on racism between black and white people so that it's a distraction from reality. It's a distraction from the real racism that a lot of black people actually experience. To me, it's so sick and sad that someone could say that they experienced racism from Mexican American people as a black person, and then that black person would be called racist because they have said that they experienced racism from Mexican people. So you mean to tell me that it's simply racist to say that you experience racism from anyone who is not black, I mean, not white? Seems like more so to me, from my point of view, that really what you're really meaning to say is that you don't like this type of racism. It doesn't appeal to you. It's not the type of racism that you want to sell or, you know, sensationalize. And, you know, this obviously empowers racism from Mexican Americans when you can be hateful towards the people and you can be discriminatory towards people and racist towards people and then call those very same people racist for saying that they should not be mistreated because they are black. That makes the perpetrator feel like they can basically do anything they want and get carte blanche to do whatever they want to anyone because for some reason it's acceptable for Mexican American people to be racist to Black American people. No race, no people should be allowed to be racist to Black American people based off of our skin tone. We shouldn't be judged. It doesn't matter what race it's coming from. I can tell you, and I'm going to talk about my personal experience with this a lot here. Specifically, I want to start off. Black Americans often get discriminated for jobs, very often by Mexican American people, many of the time. Much more than, white people in my experience. Living in the Southwest, most of the time you will see that employment is not accepted, and Black people are not really accepted in many spaces where it's basically only Mexican American people who are hired for that position. And many of the time, the person who is doing the hiring is Mexican American themselves. They'd be more likely to hire a white person, but most of the time they won't hire a white person or a Black person. I remember when I was in Reno, when I was a kid, my mother had the hardest time finding a job because of that component to that city. Was basically there's a lot of racism towards Black people because Black people basically didn't exist in that city, and most of the racism came from Mexican American people. Every now and then it could come from white people, but the difference with white people is usually it's not in the way of opportunity. Usually, if it's racism from white people, it's going to be on a trivial space. It's not going to actually be in a space where it's actually boldly there, like they're out on their job and calling you the N-word. That's never happened in my experience. A white person calling anybody that I've seen the N-word out on the job, and they were actually literally a real white person. No, that's never happened in my experience. But I can tell you that's happened with other races. And I'll get into that. But, with opportunity, with jobs and things of that nature, oftentimes you will see Black Americans are just not hired by Mexican American people for many different jobs. It's impossible sometimes to actually find. Not impossible, but I mean, it's hard to find, basically. And I remember my mother, it took her months to find a job because of strong racism with people who were of Mexican American descent who were biased against her for being Black. I find it weird. In this case, are we saying that she was racist because she was discriminated against by Mexican American people and not able to find a job? And many other Black people in that city had a very hard time? Quite obviously, saying that someone is racist because they were discriminated against is like the most ignorant thing that someone could actually say. And I've noticed personally that, in a lot of different stores, in a lot of Mexican American stores, that those stores seem to focus more on Black people. I've seen it with me, I've seen it with friends that went there, and so forth, and it's like, to me, I find it weird. People would act like, is something wrong with the black people that the Mexican American people are racist to them. No, it's not. You have to remember, if people come from a country that is very hostile to a certain people, they're not going to just come over to this country and just change their mind all of a sudden. Many of the time, they voted for those policies themselves. You might agree with the way your country treats black people. They just tolerate it in this country. And there are certain situations, like, for example, like I said, with the whole boldness of racism from Mexican American people, happens often. Like, for example, my mother, we had this situation. I was at a 7-Eleven store. I was trying to buy her, a Kit Kat or whatever. I bought the wrong Kit Kat. And I was like, I came out, she was like, oh, you got the wrong Kit Kat or whatever. And I go back in the store and I'm like, no, I actually have to return it. I got the wrong Kit Kat. So I come back and she's saying that I have to wait till the morning to do a return with the manager. And my mother is upset about this when I tell her. And so she comes back in, she's talking to the lady and stuff. I guess she's talking about that she wants to return it or whatever. Now, one thing leads to another. I wasn't actually in the store when she's talking to her, but she's just asking basically to return her Kit Kat. But the lady gets so hostile that my mother has to tape her. And she's so angry. She's like calling her the N-word. And, my mom ended up having to show her manager, obviously, her behavior. And, I mean, it was only off of sitting, like, trying to take back something, and this lady went basically haywire. And she was of Mexican American descent, of course, and was using, obviously, very foul language to a Black American woman on the job. We've never experienced anything like that. I've never experienced that with her. I've never experienced that myself. I've only experienced that kind of behavior from Mexican American people. I've experienced situations where, like, for example, sometimes you experience situations where the people will try to say stuff like, you hear this often from a lot of people where they say, like, I would be, like, take, for example, this one time at my job, for example. I was, with this one person, my manager, for example. This was a weird situation. I hated it because this is what I mean. Sometimes with Mexican Americans, I get bothered by them because they have weird ideas in their head of race, which is a problem. But let's leave that off to the side, kind of. Like, first off, I had a manager who was Mexican American. Not Mexican American, I don't really think. I think he was just Mexican. But let me tell you one thing. Honestly, not all Mexican Americans are racist, of course. I had another shift lead who was very nice to me, but he was a darker Mexican, just to point out. But he wasn't a black Mexican, he was just darker. I only noticed it because we were like similar complexions, but I don't know. Some Native American Mexicans can be darker. Point is, I had another manager that was always very argumentative and very aggressive towards black customers. One. Secondarily, he had other issues, like, for example, he would assume black people have to be a certain way. So, like, one time somebody did something wrong in the back house. I worked at a restaurant at this time, and he was saying, you don't mess up this order. These are black people. They'll get really, loud and angry, basically. And he would act like some black people were, like, scary to some extent. I don't even feel like he wasn't the worst, let's just say. I mean, like, for me, he wasn't the worst. He was problematic to some of my other coworkers who were black, though, now that I think of it. It was questionable, basically. I don't know. But, yeah, I mean, like, I've had different experiences like that. I remember my mother speaks Spanish. My mother has experienced some stuff when she's at work too, where they will say racist words to her in Spanish. They will say some stuff about her being a black woman and negative things about black women in their Spanish language. While on the job. And this, to me, is the problem. Is you're talking about people on the job in a racist manner. That's why I'm talking about it. Like, to me, it's different when you just are talking and you're just off the job. You have no consequence to the next person you're talking to. And that's what I've more so experienced with Mexican American people, is more so it affects your life. Like, racism from white people, it doesn't affect your life. If someone calls you the N-word who's just walking down the street, you're not gonna die. You're gonna be all right. Nothing's gonna happen to you. Like, literally, I don't mind if someone calls me the N-word walking down the street. That's not going to affect my life. What's gonna affect my life is if somebody's making it where I can't work. If someone is making my job a hostile environment. If someone is more negative towards me because I'm a black person working with them, or saying very racially insensitive things in the workplace. Those are concerning things. But, like I said, I've experienced some things with some Mexican American people where, like, for example, personally, it's confusing because sometimes, like, when you are more, like, they have weird ideas, basically, on race. So, like, sometimes they get confused on things. Sometimes, And I've had it where these people would do stuff like, for example, like, this is a major thing for me that's also a problem. That I don't experience with white people. And this is an offshoot situation. But like I said, with my my manager, it was kind of like he was more hostile towards some black women sometimes. But, like, with me, I think it was because my last name is Hispanic that he knew that I was Dominican, so he had a different idea in his head. Now, he hated me, but he just didn't hate me as much as the other girl who was, But, like, I don't know. But then again, at that time, I had way more issues. This is at the job where I am, I'm working at that job. Remember, I talked about this job in the past. I think it's on that video where I'm talking about colorism. Back in January, or no, it wasn't December I've talked about it, but it's the same job. I was working with this other guy who was black. He was technically light skinned and he was a mess. Like literally, we had it. It was so bad, and I was so happy what I did the last day I worked there. So, I mean, I did not concern myself with a racist Mexican when I had literally a black guy who would constantly have issues with me whenever we worked together. And then we had also, because he was gay, he had his tranny girlfriend who had even more issues with me. And it was really bad. But to me, it's just like, from my point of view, personally, I kind of felt like the whole situation, with Mexican American people acting like there's no racism. Honestly, like I said, genuinely, the kind of racism I've experienced was from Mexican American people. I would experience it at my other job too, where they would act like I've heard things like Mexican American people say like that Black American people are usually okay with drugs or they are okay with marijuana. They have this idea of Black people being criminals. Different situations like that. So I mean, like, and the thing is, I've never heard any of these comments from a white American person saying these negative things about Black American people. So saying that, not being able to admit that there's racism from Mexican American people just empowers Mexican American people to be racist. And if you ask Mexican American people if there's racism, they will always admit it and they won't deny it and they won't say anything about it. It's almost like, oh yeah, we do, but that's just life. And then on top of it, like I said, with the whole situation, with their whole racial problem, like I've had it like with dating sites, they're the worst with the dating sites because the racist ones can be problematic because they might think they have weird ideas of what black is in their heads sometimes. And sometimes I've had people add me that were Mexican American on a dating site, and they specifically say on their profile they don't want Black American women. And I'd be so confused and obviously block them, but so confused. Anyway, this is the last thing I wanted to come across was people saying that it was racist to say that Mexican Americans are not white. If you didn't know they weren't white, I don't know what's wrong or what's going on with you. It's kind of obvious that they are not white because if you actually do a DNA test, on average, most Mexican Americans are half white, Spanish blood, half Native American, and between 1 and 5% Black. Now, obviously, that was not half and half. That's roughly half and half, basically. You can look that up. I might put like a link in there to show you what the um, genetic testing autosomally that was done on samples of Mexican American people and Mexican people. But yeah, generally there are half half Native Mexican, half white, basically, with a little pinch of black. And generally, yes, they do have like 1% black in them, usually. But Mexican Americans, you could say, yes, they're biologically mixed, but do they identify as white? Maybe their identity is white. Maybe we should respect their identity, right? That's the next argument, obviously. But the truth is, look at the demographics in Mexico. That's what I mean. When people talk, they need to educate themselves first and then talk. Because right now, people talk about a whole bunch of stuff without actually knowing the real facts of the situation. Anyway, Mexicans in Mexico, the census says that they identify as mestizo, 60% of the population. 30% of the population identifies as Native American. And then like 9 or 10% identify as white. So the majority of Mexican Americans are mestizo or Native American. Do you know what mestizo means? It means half white, half Native American. What I just previously said. In our society, that is basically Native American. And if you look at the genetics of Mexican Americans, many of the time they're actually above 50% Native American. So technically, in our country, we would not even consider that mix. You have to think a Black American who is 55% Black, someone like myself who's a little over 50% Black, 53% Black, we're considered Black in our country. So obviously, a Mexican American person is not white in our country. And they know they're not white because they put themselves down as mestizo. So they know they're not white. Now, some people would say that maybe Mexican American people don't want to be white. Why do you think they want to be white? What's telling you that? Oh, well, you know why I think that? Because, like I said, my job that I worked and many other jobs that I've worked piqued my interest on this because I've been a person who takes surveys often. I basically take demographics often, and I did in many Hispanic communities as well. But this kind of piqued my interest. Look up Hispanic demographics in any state, in any city. Now, you can put yourself down as Hispanic, but you have to put yourself down as a race, right? What race do the majority of Hispanic people put on a census in any state that are Mexican American? Generally, they put down that they are white, knowing full well they put themselves down as mestizo in Mexico. So quite clearly, they are aware that they are half Native American, half white. They are genetically white and Native American. So they literally are, exactly what they think they are, but they put themselves down as white in this country. Now, the reason they put themselves down as white in this country is, of course, because, they value whiteness, but it's more than that. It's because I think, this is my theory, and someone can give me another explanation. I am open to suggestions. But basically, they put themselves down as white because they, in their own country, were the majority. They were the basic standard, basically. And so, they don't want to be seen as people of color or the people who are the minority because they are familiar with being the majority. And they identify more with white because they value whiteness. They don't want to align with their Native American heritage. That's why you won't ever see a Mexican American person put down Native American and not white. You, at best, sometimes you will get some put other, very rarely, and then some will put white and Native American. Very, very, very rare, basically. Generally, they put down white. I think it's about a 70 to 80% or more rate that Mexican Americans put themselves down as white. And it's so weird because it's like, this is what messes up our difference in identity because, like, for example, they will sometimes do crazy things like thinking standard, basically. And so, you know, I'm sorry about that. There's a bit of a problem. They don't want to be seen as people of color or as people who are the minority because they are familiar with the majority. And they identify more with white because they value whiteness. They don't want to align with the Native American heritage. That's why you won't ever see a Mexican American person put down Native American and not white. You at best sometimes you will get some to other, very rarely, and then some with white and Native American. Very, very, very sometimes very rarely, just very rarely. You might sometimes it also want to be like mixed, but not like well, actually, I guess that goes with other though, honestly. So yeah, I don't know really, but generally, I think it's about a 70 to 80% or more rate that Mexican Americans themselves down as hello? Hello? I don't know if I can be heard. It's not. Oh, it's moving now. I'm sorry. That's why I left. I'm sorry. Anyway, going back to what I was saying. We don't see white as that. We just don't because, in our history, white people don't come in that color if they're just white. It's just how it is. But Black Americans and Native Americans and Asians, we all come in those colors as well, naturally, without any white influence. So, you know, to me, it's kind of weird sometimes because I was like working with someone and people were acting like my manager at that time, my female manager at that time was white and stuff. And they would describe her that way, and people wouldn't know, like American people, white American and Black American people, wouldn't know who they were talking about because it described a white woman, and we clearly saw a Black woman. So they have a very skewed, weird view of whiteness. Now, is that, wrong? I don't really think that their idea of whiteness is wrong, but I just think that they know that they're not white because if they thought that they were white, then they would be putting themselves down as white in Mexico. But basically, basically, no one puts themselves down as white in Mexico. They put themselves down as Native American or mestizo, which is part Native American. That tells you that, yes, of course they want to be white. And if you look at the percentage basically of their population, as opposed to here, it's about 70, I think, to 80% of Mexicans put themselves down as if 70 to 80% put themselves down as white here, and there's basically 69 to 70% that are white or mestizo identifying. Most of that is mestizo. 60% of that is mestizo. That tells you that basically 6 out of 7, 6 out of 8 of those are people who identify as mestizo in their own country. Which tells you that these people, they know they're not white. So this is just a fact, really. And I mean, if Mexicans want to trick us and make us think that they actually think they're white, and they don't know that they're not white, or they know they're not white and, they don't want to be white, they should either, put themselves down as white in their own country or put themselves down as mestizo in their own country, in this country as Mexican Americans, I'm saying. So that's how I see it. I just see it like, you can't have it both ways like this. You're the exact same people from Mexico to here. Yet over there you're mestizo, over here you're white. That tells us you're not white. And that tells us that you want to be white when you're here. So it is what it is. That's not racism to admit that Mexican American people want to be white and are not white. And yes, to me, I'm like, I will never be white, okay? Anyone who's not white will never be white. I don't see how that's racist. It's not racist to say that someone who's not white is never going to be white. Like, it's basically past, present, future term, basically. You weren't white. You aren't white. You will not be white. I am not white. I was not white, and I will not be white. These are just facts. There's nothing racist about that. So to me, I just found that weird. People keep saying that that's a racist statement, or that any of that was racist, because this lets you know, I mean, people really don't understand the reality of the situation. People don't understand the reality of, the country, Mexico, and how they treat Black Mexicans, their attitude on Afro-Mexicans, how Afro-Mexicans aren't accepted as other Mexicans. This lets you know also how, people don't pay attention to simple stats that would just let you know that, no, this is not incorrect. This is true. These people put themselves down as deceased, when they come here, they put themselves down as white. They're literally the same person. They're the same people. They were put down as mestizo there. They were put down here as white. And nobody forces them to do either of these. They choose to do this on their own. This is what they want to do. So this, I feel like I said, in Mexico, that's what they know they are. And over here, they want to be, So, that in itself, the whole thing, the fact of putting yourself down as, white, when you just put yourself down as mestizo, lets us know how you value whiteness. Your country's attitude towards Black Mexican people, and their attitude actually on Native Mexicans too is not that good either. Lets you know where they stand on racism, and it really lets you know because of how they seem to treat it. They don't treat it like it's a bad. They don't treat it like it's wrong. They treat it like that's normal, like that's a part of who they are. That's what they are, and they might even honestly and probably do agree with it, because you have to think. The people put that mentality into their government. They put that outlook on Black people because that's how their outlook is generally in their society. Now, that doesn't mean, like I said, that all Mexican Americans are just racist people. It doesn't mean Mexicans in Mexico are racist people. You know, you can be a minority of thought. Just like during slavery, there were plenty of white people who were against slavery, just like Mexican people in Mexico can be against the treatment of Afro Mexicans and how they're treated. When Black Mexicans are seen as inferior, Black Americans are subjected to that racism. And it's brought over here and implemented on Black Americans just as it was implemented in Mexico. There are some other situations, like this one situation where this Mexican American cashier, I don't know if he was American, but he may have been, I'm not sure. He would say things about Black American customers where he would imply that they had food stamps and they had assistance of some sort. You see all sorts of different types of racism like that and like hostility against Black American people who frequent their stores and frequent their places that they work at. Even if they work at a little broken down side store, for example, they still sometimes show that hostility towards them. Like I said, also, the racism goes back to Mexican American people who have self hate for themselves when they put down that they're white, obviously, because they don't want to acknowledge the non white side. That makes them feel, I guess, ashamed. And, people of color who are Black obviously get that, the brunt of that, because they have that self hate within themselves. If they hate being half Native American, how do you think they feel about Black Americans? Especially when we see how they treat Black Mexican people in their own country, when they're left to their own devices. They see it as an insult that they are not seen as white, as depicted in that video. Sometimes, sometimes rarely, they try to imply that they are white because they say that that's what they're mixed with. But saying that someone is not white is not an insult if white is not better than other races. If you think it's an insult, that says a lot about you and nothing about the person who said that you are not white. It just says that you confirmed what she claimed. Said that you want to be white and you are not white. and you got offended because someone said that you were not white and will never be white. That you are offended by not being white because what? You think white is better than you, right? Because obviously you're offended by not being white. So you think not being white is bad. That is showing your own racism about yourself and your own self hate about yourself. That's got nothing to do with the crazy lady who hates police. It has to do with the racism within your community. It has to do with the racism that you don't want to face because in reality, our society isn't trying to accept uplifting and being racist towards other races and having this racial hierarchy of white people. In our society, in America, we've tried to work towards being more colorblind than actually thinking about race like that. But when you think of white as better, you obviously aren't. You obviously think of yourself as less than. You obviously think. What do you think? If you think that something is wrong with you or you've been insulted because you were told you were not white, what do you think of black people? Because everybody understands that black people aren't white, you know? So if we're not white and you think that it's an insult to not be white and you think not being white is bad, what are you saying about black people who are not white? It says everything about how he views black people. And she basically exposed him when, you get upset about things like that. Now, I've seen other people too, Mexican American people, get upset at that. And it's funny to me. It's just like, well, if you get upset about it, you've been exposed. If you get upset about not being white, you've been exposed. You've already shown that you are exactly what she described. Now, you could pretend you're not upset about it, but if you are one of those people who is putting down that they're mestizo in Mexico, coming over here and, becoming an American and, putting yourself down as white, it only leaves us with one thought. You know you're not white, you put yourself down as mestizo in the other country, and then you came here, you put yourself down as white, or your family did it, like if you're born here, of course, and you've been putting yourself down as white, you still come from two Mexican American people who came from Mexico, who put themselves down as mestizo, and then came here and put themselves down as white. It's the same thing. So you basically proven that you are not white by genetics, by your own admittance, and then come over here and proven that you want to be white. Their society as an all says basically how whiteness is valued for them. And, if they didn't value whiteness, they wouldn't come here and put themselves down as white. They just wouldn't do that. They'd have pride in who they were racially. But instead, no, you put yourself down as white. That says what you wish and want to be. In completion, being open and honest about racism, wherever it may come from, is not being racist. It's being strong enough to face it. And it's just that when people are strong enough to face racism, very often racists will shame them. races will use different tactics to try to shut their voices down. It's a common thing because nobody wants to be admitted as a bigoted individual. If you are a bigot, you don't want to be outed, you know? So you put shame on the victim of your discriminatory tactics, and in turn hope that socially you will be protected and supported, and it will further shun and quiet the voices of people who experience this discriminatory and racist behavior from these racist tormentors. So that's all I have to say on that. Thanks for listening, and bye.